Pardon, and thanks everyone for coming to hear my overview of leaf mining Diptera in North America. So, a leaf miner is an insect that spends at least part of its larval life living and feeding inside of a leaf. And as it feeds, it makes an externally visible trail that we call a leaf mine. And 10 or 15 years ago, I became fascinated by the idea that you can often identify these insects to species just by noting what the host plant is and then studying the characteristics of the mines. So as Martin mentioned, I've spent the past decade or so compiling this ebook that's now over 2,000 pages long that consists largely of keys where you start with the host plant genus and you can identify all the mines that can be found on the plant genera in America, north of Mexico. And I don't know much about identifying flies really, so that's the reason I've been able to go beyond just a massive literature review and incorporate my own observations, is that all of these dipterists have been kind enough to examine all the flies I've reared from leaf mines. And I want to especially acknowledge Owen Lonsdale, who's examined all of the hundreds of agamizid flies, and every time he comes across one that seems to be new, he takes the time to make these meticulous drawings of the male genitalia and prepare morphological descriptions so we can put names on all of these. And I also want to acknowledge all of the naturalists who have sent me specimens and shared their observations of leaf mines with me, some of whom now have agramizids named after them. And this includes hundreds of people who have uploaded their observations and photos of leaf mines to the Leaf Miners of North America project I created on iNaturalist. There are now about 60,000 observations, and every time I sit down to peruse them, I come across new host and distribution records, and often mines that are completely unknown. So that's why another reason besides its size that I'm not committing this book to print, because I'm constantly having to update it. And before I get into the 11 known families of leaf mining Diptera in North America, I want to mention that Cecidomyids obviously have many species with herbivorous larvae that live and feed inside of leaves, but none of them really qualify as leaf miners. I don't think anyone would consider these complex detachable galls to be leaf mines, but some species, like Parallelodiplosis subtruncata, make perfectly flat leaf galls that do superficially resemble leaf mines. So if you flip this leaf over, you'll see that each circle has a larva feeding just beneath the epidermis, but the cavities in which these larvae are feeding are formed entirely by the plant as a response to the insect's presence, rather than any excavating being done by the larvae. And you can prove to yourself that that's the case by watching the same gulls over multiple days. And the larvae are just moving around, drinking the juices within that pre-existing cavity. So although there is one species that's commonly referred to as the boxwood leaf miner, there's no such thing as a leaf mining Cecidomyid. There are, however, in the same superfamily, two known leaf mining cyarids in North America, both of which were named in the past few years. This species, Zygonura calthella, is a specialist on marsh marigold, and the larvae form these brown trails that radiate into the leaf blade from the petiole. They also continue down the petiole, and if you split it open, you'll find multiple black-headed larvae feeding in the center. The larvae normally pupate inside the petiole, but in my rearing containers I found a few loose pupae like this one. And in the process of rearing this species, I also reared 3 other flies that feed as secondary inhabitants in the mines of the Zygonura, including the sporid Megacelia limburgensis, Drosophilid Scaptomyza pallida, and this undescribed chloropid in the genus Elachyptera, which is possibly an obligate associate of Zygonura calthella. I reared it every time with every collection of mines. I don't think it's been found anywhere else. And the other species is Phytocyara graylockensis, which I found near the summit of Mount Greylock in western Massachusetts, where it was feeding on leaves of blue-bead lily, but I've since reared it from several totally unrelated herbaceous plants, monocots, dicots, and ferns. So the species is a generalist. The larvae start out as leaf miners. You can see a few larvae there in the backlit view. But then they transition to feeding externally on the lower surface, and this is known as window feeding, when an insect consumes all of a leaf except for one epidermis, which is left as a transparent window. So that when finished feeding, the larvae start scraping up little bits of debris and leaf tissue, which they form into cocoons on the leaves, little oval cocoons, and then when the adults emerge, the pupal exuviae are left poking out one end. There are also a few leaf-mining chironomids, including two species in the genus Cricotopus, which both mine in leaves of pondweeds in the genus Potamogeton. One of them is in floating leaves and one in submerged leaves. And then in Stenochironomus subgenus Pedalofolius, there are, I think, 4 species in the subgenus, and they all mine in dead leaves from trees after they've fallen and become submerged in water. And adding to those known leaf-mining chironomids, just a few months ago, the species Metriocnemus erythranthii was described. Its primary hosts are monkey flowers in the genus Erythranthi. The larvae make these linear mines. They feed as leaf miners throughout their development, but they're able to exit their mines and establish new ones in fresh leaves. And as with cyarids, and unlike all other leaf mining Diptera, the larvae have sclerotized head capsules. And they pupate in gelatinous masses that are usually inside the leaf mines. In the process of while we were working on describing the species, I found several examples of the mines on iNaturalist, so I contacted the observers and asked them to collect specimens, and several people took me up on that, and as a result, the type series includes specimens from Pennsylvania, Iowa, Oklahoma, California, Oregon, and British Columbia. So in the Pacific Northwest, the species has a very wide host range. In California and Oklahoma, it's only been found on Erythranthia species. And then in Iowa and Pennsylvania, it's only been found on aquatic speedwells in the genus Veronica. And in those speedwell mines in Iowa, larvae of another midge, Metriocnemus urinotus, were found feeding in the Erythranthii mines. And this species was described in the 1800s, but nothing has been published about its larval habits until now. So here are the Erythranthii larvae, the big green ones, and then that little dark banded larva is the urinotus larva. And also just nearby in the same stream, the urinotus larvae were also found feeding in their own mines in Impatiens cotyledons. And these larvae, as they grew, transitioned to window feeding on the surface. And another newly described species, Limnathis viribus, was also reared from leaf mines of Metriocnemus erythranthii in both Iowa and Oregon. And as far as we know, it's an obligate associate of that species. And so it has uniformly dark larvae. And John van der Linden has a neat video that's on YouTube showing this larva nibbling around the edges of the mine expanding. So that concludes the Nematosera portion of this program. In Dolichopodidae, almost all of the species have predatory larvae, but this one genus, Phrypticus, has leaf mining or stem boring species. They're all in graminoids, mostly in wetlands, but this particular individual was reared from an upland grass. Sapphridid fruit flies have 2 leaf mining genera that are native to North America. One is Eulia, which has two strictly western species and one transcontinental species, Eulia fratria. They're associated with plants in the parsley family and make these brown, blotchy mines, often with multiple larvae feeding together. And the leaves quickly crumple up and dry out, so it's important that these larvae have the ability to exit and establish new mines in fresh leaves, as this one has done. You can see the entrance hole in the upper right corner. And tephridids and all of the remaining families are schizophoreans, so that instead of the mature larva shedding its skin to reveal a pupa, it forms a puparium by hardening its skin, and the adult escapes the puparium by having its telinum, this big balloon, inflate from its forehead, and then it recedes into frontal suture. And since I reared thousands of flies, I had the opportunity a few times to witness them emerging from their puparia. So here's an agromyzid pumping its telinum in and out as it wriggles out of its puparium. And then it takes them a few hours to extend their wings and get fully colored. But back to the tephridids, the other genus is Tripetta, which again has several western species and one transcontinental species, Tripetta flaviola. As far as we know, these are all associated with the aster family. And flaviola mines are these broad linear tracks, but they're sometimes, as in this example, so contorted, like intestine-like, that they appear to be blotches on first glance. And there's also an introduced species, Acidia cognata, which feeds on the introduced European plant, coltsfoot, which is known from a single North American specimen that was collected in Quebec about a decade ago and identified by DNA barcoding. But iNaturalist observations of leaf mines and adults have shown that it occurs in at least 3 other eastern Canadian provinces. So I already mentioned one chloropid that feeds as a secondary inhabitant in mines of another fly. As far as I know, there's just one leaf mining genus, Eugaurax, which Matt Bertone will be giving a whole talk about this fly and its relatives right here in about an hour. So all I'm going to say about this one is it makes linear mines in floating marsh pennywort and has larvae that are very unlike any other leaf miner I've seen, long and skinny with these prominent caudal protuberances. In the Loxiniidae, there are several genera that are known to mine in dead leaves and leaf litter. These include Sapromyza, Camptoprosopella, Homonura, and Minetia. And this individual I found clinging tenaciously to a spinach leaf in my garden, and I picked the leaf and brought it into my house to take some pictures of it. And by the time I walked into my house, it had moved to the other side of the leaf to reveal that it had been resting on an anthomiid leaf mine. And then just a few days later, I found this other Minetia species clinging equally tenaciously to a scathophagid leaf mine on a trillium leaf. And I started to wonder, do these sometimes lay eggs in occupied mines of other flies and develop inside those? And the following spring, I collected some agromyzid mines like this one, and like a week later the agromyzid larvae exited and pupated, but there was this one larva that kept feeding a while longer and was white instead of yellow like the agromyzid larvae. And then its puparium had this whitish calcareous residue that's characteristic of Loxiniid puparia, and the following year this adult Minetia emerged, confirming my suspicion. Drosophilids, again, I already mentioned Scaptomyza pallida, sometimes feeds within mines of other insects as well as various other damaged plant tissue. But there are also true leaf miners in the same genus. Scaptomyza flava is a cosmopolitan species that is a leaf miner mostly of mustards, including this wild tower mustard. Larvae make initially very narrow linear mines, and which suddenly expand, I think, in the third instar into blotches with widely scattered lumps of frass. It also mines leaves of kale and broccoli, and also in my garden in the pea plants. And in New Zealand, it's been found on a dozen or so other plant families. Scaptomyza larvae can either exit their mines to pupate or pupate inside the mines. And their puparia have this distinctive flattened interior ends. A related family of Hydridae has several leaf mining genera, though by far the largest is Hydrelia, which are leaf miners of aquatic plants. This undetermined species I reared from fully submerged leaves of Vallisneria, American eelgrass, these long linear mines. And in one of those leaves, I found this puparium that at first I thought that was a parasitoid wasp pupa inside the puparium, but as it developed, it got browner and hairier, and I realized it was just a fly pupa in there. And eventually this fly emerged and swam to the surface. I found it just resting there like a water strider, and it turned out to be a different species, Hydrelia facetibia, which is supposed to feed on Potamogeton species instead of Vallisneria. And this illustrates a problem with Hydrelia host records, which is that many species have the habit of, when they're finished feeding, they'll swim to some random plant and make a short mine, just a centimeter or so long, without feeding, just for the purpose of forming their puparium. Hydrelia albulabris is a European species that wasn't known in North America until I collected a pinch of duckweed in Maine just to identify it, and when I was looking at it under the scope, I noticed some larvae inside the thalli. So with the addition of this species, there are now 4 North American anhydrids known to mine in these tiny leaves, just 2 or 3 millimeters long. So there's not much room in there for mine morphology to look at, but here's a thallus with a larva inside, one with a puparium, and one with a fly just about ready to emerge. Hydrelia valida mines in an intertidal grass, and another intertidal leaf miner is this bizarre kind of beetle-like fly, Clamendurium americanum. It mines in leaves of annual sea blight, which they're very narrow, fleshy leaves. And this species, like all ephydrids that are leaf miners, glue their elongate white eggs to the surface of a leaf, and their puparia are formed inside of leaves. In the Anthemyidae, I already mentioned, or I showed a leaf mine of this species, Pegamia hyoscyami, which to gardeners, this is probably the most familiar leaf miner, it and its close relative, Pegamia bettii. They're in spinach and chard and related plants. Pegamia is the largest genus of leaf mining anthemyids. All of the species in the nominate subgenus are leaf miners. And they all glue these beautiful reticulated white eggs to the undersides of leaves. And when multiple eggs are laid together, the larvae will feed together for much of their lives. So this same spinach leaf backlit, you can see, I think there are 11 larvae all feeding together right there. And anthemyid larvae exit their mines and burrow into the ground to pupate. And the majority of Pegamia species are miners in various families in the order Caryophyllales, as is the case with this western species, Pegamia pseudobicolor, which is mostly associated with Polygonaceae, but in Washington I found it mining leaves of oxalis, which is a totally unrelated plant, but both oxalis and various Polygonaceae have oxalic acid in them, and they taste the same to us and presumably to the flies as well. And then there are Pegamias on various other plants, the most distinctive mines being the ones that the Asteraceae feeding group, like Pegamia cardivorum on thistle, make these digitate blotch mines with all the frass deposited in the central lump. The genus Cheirosia is entirely made up of fern specialists, and there's one group of species that are leaf miners. There weren't very many host records, but I've now reared most of the eastern species, including Cheirosia filicis from interrupted fern and cinnamon fern. And these fern leaf mines very quickly shrivel up and dry out, so I like to check for that tiny white egg on the underside of the frond to make sure I'm looking at a leaf mine. Another muscoid family, Scathophagidae, has a few leaf mine species, all of which are associated with monocots. The most common and widespread species is Paralleloma vittatum, which is found in at least 3 different monocot families, including the orchids. And scathophagid eggs are similar to anthemiad eggs, but have these lateral flanges on them that sometimes curl around the edges of the egg. And the larvae usually burrow into the ground to pupate, but occasionally in vittatum, the puparia are inside the leaves. This species, Neochirosia nuda, all of its hosts are also used by Paralleloma vittatum, but you can distinguish its mines because instead of white eggs glued to the lower surface, it has brown eggs glued to the upper surface along the veins. Several there and there, but there's a close-up of one. Looks kind of like a hot dog. And finally, we come to the agromysid flies, which, so they're known as the leaf miner flies. Obviously, they're not the only leaf mining flies, but it's fair to say most leaf mining flies are in this family. There are well over 800 species in North America. Owen Lonsdale and I have named 62 of them in the past 5 years. So Owen has named some others on his own, and we have another 20 or so in the works right now. And not all agromysids are leaf miners, but many are. And they have piercing ovipositors, the females, that are used to insert eggs in leaf tissue. So you can see 3 eggs there that have been inserted in punctures in the leaf, and the larvae have already hatched out and are forming a common mine. But these other dots around the eggs are host-feeding punctures. So female agromysids also use their ovipositors just to stab the leaf and drink the juices that bubble out of the wounds. And this species, Japan agromyza viridula, does that in oak leaves when they're first expanding in the spring. And as the leaves continue to expand, their punctures stretch out into conspicuous holes, which has given this fly the common name of oak shot hole leaf miner. But the holes have nothing to do with the leaf mines, which look like that. The diversity of agromysids is so overwhelming that I decided to just tell you about a few species I found around my house, starting with 3 whose holotypes came from the front yard. So, Phytomyza erigeranus, I found mining leaves of the very first wildflower that popped up in our yard after we bought our house and didn't mow the lawn. And so daisy fleabane, its leaf mine is very typical of agromysids, being linear with frass and alternating strips or grains. And the reason they alternate like that is that agromysid larvae lie on one side and poop on the other side of the mine, and then they roll over, poop on the other side, and keep going back and forth. Whereas most leaf mining larvae are belly down or belly up, so they make a central frass line in linear mines. And this species exits its mines to make shiny black puparia. Ophiomya parda got its name, parda is Latin for leopard, from the spotted pattern of frass in its mines, very widely spaced frass lumps. And the neat thing about this species is the completed mine looks empty from above, but if you flip over the leaf, you'll see that the larva has mined another centimeter or so and hidden its puparium just under the epidermis, so it's not visible from above. Ophiomya euthemi does exactly the opposite. It mostly mines in the lower surface and then at the last minute switches to the upper surface to form its puparium. And to give you a picture of what's going on there, here's a cross-section of a leaf. So most of the less specialized leaf mining groups I've talked about make what are called full-depth mines, where they're consuming all of the leaf mesophyll and maybe even some of the epidermal cells, leaving just the cuticle intact. whereas the more specialized leaf miners like agromyzids are often just feeding in the palisade mesophyll or just the spongy mesophyll or even just the upper or lower epidermis. So their mines are more opaque and only visible from one side. This is a female of an as yet undetermined Melanagromyzus species that I see commonly in the spring on leaves of garden phlox around my yard. The females hang out on the leaves, ovipositing and making post-feeding punctures. And if you look closely at some of the leaves with that stippling on them, you'll see faint green lines where the larvae have mined along a vein into the midrib and then down the petiole, and they continue feeding its stem border. So this is a cross-section of a stem, and there's no external evidence after that. I've been able to find a few parasitized puparia by splitting open stems, but it seems like the healthy larvae always continue into the roots. So this spring I dug up a few clumps of phlox and put them in garbage bags in the corner of my office and got one male from that, which I'm eagerly awaiting Owen's assessment of that one. So just a little bit into the woods from my yard, I was able to figure out the life history of Ophiomyia congregata, which was described over 100 years ago but had no known host. In the late summer and fall, it makes these very disjointed looking mines because the larvae are alternating between the upper and lower leaf surfaces. And then they continue down the petiole, overwinter in the crown or roots of the plant. Then they come back up in the spring, mining into the petioles of new leaves, sometimes making very short excursions into the leaf blades. And then they finally pupate in the petiole or leaf in May or so. And then continuing down the hill to my neighbor's beaver pond, we find the type localities of Phytomyza tigris, which is named for its tiger-striped puparium, and Phytomyza actiivora, which makes communal blotch mines in leaves of Actia species. And this species is a little ambivalent about whether it wants to pupate inside or outside the leaves. And finally, last spring, John van der Linden told me that he'd found an agromyzid puparium in a liverwort in Iowa, and I'd heard rumors of such things, but no agromyzid had ever been reared from a liverwort in North America. So I ran out into the woods looking for a thallus liverwort, and about a mile into the woods, I finally found one little clump about that big on a rock at the edge of a stream. I didn't see any mines in it, but I picked up just like a square inch chunk, and I held it up to the sun, and I could see a faint brown line that I thought might be a leaf mine, so I stuck it in a vial, and a month later, 6 of these flies emerged. Owen just last week identified this as Phytoliriomyza dorsata, described 150 years ago or so, and its host was, nothing was published about its larval habits until just last fall. A Japanese study described 42 new species of bryophyte mining Phytoliriomyza. This was one of 2 already described species that they discussed, so this is a Polarctic species. But interestingly, they found all of the species to be highly host-specific and found this one only on Marcantia, and mine was reared from Connocephalum. They had Connocephalum in Japan, but just got 3 other species from it. So, lots more to learn about these flies, and I hope some of you will be inspired to look for them wherever you live. Thanks. Time for questions. You first, I think.
I'm still trying to formulate how I'm going to phrase this, but you seem to be looking for plant material at kind of one level, ground level, something that's easily accessible. Do you survey higher up in like tree canopy?
I haven't done much climbing into trees, but if not everyone heard the question was that am I missing things in the canopy or other strata of vegetation, basically. And I haven't really climbed into trees looking for leaf mines, but you can find mines in leaf litter. And there have been studies of preferences. I think some of the conifer needle mining moths are found more commonly at different heights, but otherwise, I don't know too much about that, but it doesn't seem like, I think it's more about the amount of light or shade versus distance from the ground.
You did talk about bryophytes, which I was going to ask you about, but I'm kind of curious about other vascular cryptogams than ferns, like equisetum or lycopods, whether there's anything in them?
Yeah, in the original version of this talk before Martin told me it should be half an hour, I had a little bit about equisetum mining Liriomyza species. There are, I think, 3 of those in North America. And wait, what besides equisetum and ferns?
Lycopods?
Oh, lycopods. It doesn't seem like any insects feed on lycopods as far as I think there's one tortuousid moth that has the name Lycopodiella that I guess it feeds in the strobili or something, but they're usually pretty immaculate. Anybody else? Oh, yeah.
Can you talk more about those the loxodeids that were in other mines? Do they affect the original host, or are they just kind of equal?
Well, so there's the only observation of that actually happening is that one I had that the single individual that emerged, and the other larvae had already emerged and pupated by the time it was done feeding, so it didn't seem to have any effect on them, but I could imagine that sometimes happening. And as far as the other things like the chlorophids and phorids and the Scaptomyza that we're feeding inside of, I think they're mostly detritivores inside the mines of the other, so they're not really affecting the larvae.
So I'm just curious about the Lycopodiid as well. Do you think it's actually going in to hunt for the other leaf mining larvae?
It seems like it's pretty well established that the Dolichopodids, the Crypticus species, are actually herbivorous. I don't have personal experience with them, but yeah.
Are any of these agromyzids predators of other agromyzids inside the leaf mines?
I haven't heard any examples of that. There might be some cases where species that are normally solitary, if their mines merge, they'll attack each other. I don't think I've run into that with agromyzids, but some of the leaf mining beetles and moths, that's been observed. Yeah.
Do you sometimes see mines of different species merging and living in the common mine, or?
I've seen mines of different species merge. I don't think I've seen larvae actually feeding together. I've seen things that are not leaf miners enter mines of other insects and feeding apparently harmoniously together. But, yeah, I'm sure it happens occasionally.
Do you have any estimate of the rate of parasitism, by Hymenoptera?
I would say about half of what I rear is wasps instead of the intended leaf miners. And yeah, if anyone knows any Hymenopterists that are looking for material, I've got about a zillion Elophid wasps in the Canadian National Collection that are all mounted and ready for someone to work on them, and tons of braconids and other things too.